Taylor Walker from the Adelaide Crows, and you're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Shannon Hearn from the West Coast Eagles.
This is Nathan Jones from the Melbourne Football Club.
Phil Davis from the GWS Giants.
It's Brad Avery from the Port Adelaide Football Club, and you're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Number 3 of the 50 most relevant, Collingwood ruckman, Brodie Grundy. Yeah, I think he's going to be the best ruckman this year, and there is plenty of stuff to talk about this very fantasy relevant pie. Joining me live in the studio this time, a big Pies fan and a massive fan of Brodie himself. I got Tim from the Coaches Panel. Hey, mate. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. And, listening to the draft when the Pies picked up Grundy with pick 18 a few years ago, just let out the big fist pump.
You're driving down the Eastern Freeway in Melbourne like, yeah, boy, just got my pie. And look, if that's exactly how you feel as a keeper league owner when it comes to Brodie Grundy as well. You're just tucking this young gun away, still in his early 20s. This ruckman has plenty of time left to dominate, and he certainly did that last year. 151 was his best score from an AFL fantasy perspective against the Gold Coast Suns. What was this? 167 against the Swans. A 120 seasonal average in AFL fantasy. Rarefied air to get that sort of an average, especially out of a ruckman, while it was even 10 points better in a Supercoach. In Supercoach, he is going to set you back over 700,000. In AFL Fantasy, well over 870,000, and a little bit less than that in Dream Team. But really, you are forking out a fair chunk of change for Brodie Grundy. And Tim, fair enough too, because when we talk about Brodie Grundy, he really is the epitome of what it means to be that modern ruckman. When it comes to the hit-outs, he's got that ability to match it with the best along the likes of a Max Gawn and certainly give strong hit-outs to advantage. But then around the ground, in what is already a scary midfield unit for the Magpies, he just adds another layer to that, not just with his tackle pressure, but his aerobic capacity and endurance. He's just a phenomenal ruckman.
He is. He's one of those guys who just likes to fill up the stat sheet, all the different categories. He, he could easily sort of pass as a midfielder, much like Dean Cox. I know he gets likened to that quite a bit. He's just around the ground taking marks, handballs, kicks, tackles. He's not just a beanpole getting hit-outs, that's for sure.
No, he's not. Well, he's still averaging 20-odd disposals per game, which is about 5 more on average, more than Brodie Grundy. Still picking up a handful of tackles. Again, substantially more than Max Gawn. Now, they're different ruckmen, and nor do I want this podcast to be contrasting Gawn to Brodie Grundy, but they're the differences about them, and that's what made him such a dangerous fantasy player, not just last year, but even in 2017. And the years kind of leading up to it, we started to see, and long-time keeper league coaches will have known, when Brodie fills out in his body, when he gets that strength in his body, because he was quite a slender young man when he got drafted, as often these 200-odd centimetre ruckman style guys are. But now, ever since he's filled out, he's always shown fantasy chops. And in 2017, he averaged 106 in AFL Fantasy Dream Team, 13 tons, 4 of them were 120. This is 2017, by the way. And then for Supercoach, 9 tons, 3 of them 120. And as we kind of entered it into the start of last year, many people knew the potential of what Brodie Grundy would deliver for us. But there was one big reason that was scaring a lot of fantasy coaches off last year, and that was, if Mason Cox shares the ruck role, Brodie's not going to be good enough for us. So a lot of coaches didn't start Brodie last year. And in round 1, they were pretty right. But from there on in, Brodie just went on a point-scoring tear.
Yeah, and if you look at Mason Cox's sort of ruck hitouts or ruck duels last year, it wasn't really that high.
No.
Like, he was clearly played as a key forward and just a pinch hit in the ruck. He was not a second ruckman. He wasn't getting 20 hitouts. He was getting 4 or 5 hit-outs a game.
Yeah, I think there's about 4 or 5 games right throughout the year that he got more than 10 hit-outs, across the statistical board. And in fact, it was in round 1 that he got his highest hit-out. It was 18 hit-outs for Mason Cox. For the rest of the year, he didn't crack over 15. So you're right. From round 1, Bucks was certainly still experimenting with their roles, and really, from a Collingwood perspective, it was kind of that game against the Adelaide Crows at Adelaide Oval that everything started to really turn, that season-defining moment that, obviously went on to be such a fantastic season for the Collingwood Football Club. But he lifted his seasonal average, Brodie Grundy, last year, 14 points in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team, up off his 2017 average, up to that 120, while in Supercoach, it was a massive 33 average point jump. That is insane for a guy that was already verging on 100. In AFL fantasy, that 120 average included 19 tons. That's ridiculous. 19 tons. 13 of those hundreds were over 120 and 5 of them were over 140, while in Supercoach, same, 19 tons. 12 over 120, 7, an insane 7 over 150, and a lower score of 95. He was ridiculously good last year.
He was, and I know finals don't count, but in Supercoach, I think his prelim and his grand final are both over 140 as well. So
yeah, 146 against the Tigers, 141 against West Coast, and the two other finals, 118 and 116.
Yeah, so he's still doing it against the good teams. And look, as you said, if you look at his career progression, he went up 14 points in fantasy. Fantasy looks a lot more like a ladder he's slowly climbing, and went 60s, 90s, 100. 106, 120, whereas Supercoach had 3 straight years in the 90s and then went bang to 130. So if you juxtapose it with the fantasy, you can sort of see that it is on the up, but in Supercoach it might have seemed like he slowed down a little bit and then just went bang.
He's one of these guys that when you're spending such a vast amount of money, clearly he becomes a captaincy option. And without Tom Mitchell, who was our perma captain for most of the year, even for, Supercoach with the rolling lockout, you generally tend to look for guys that were early enough in the round that you go, okay, the Friday night game, I'll look for my Fifes early in the year. I'll look for my Dangerfields. I'll look for my Kellys. I'll look for my Cripps, these guys. And then I know I've got this safety net of Tom Mitchell. There is no safety net in this season for us with Tom Mitchell, but would it be a fair thing to say that Brodie Grundy is our safest 100 scoring player across all formats as we enter into 2019? I know it's a big call to kind of make, but would you put him in that same or close enough to that same sort of category of he's one of the safest bets we've got this year?
I think he's definitely one of the safest. You could argue whether others have a higher ceiling, but certainly he's one of the safest. As you said, he's consistently scoring high, and he's really got no question marks over role. No. There's not going to be any change to the way him and Mason Cox play, especially in the finals. Mason Cox clearly a key forward now. He's not going to get any extra hit-outs than he did last year. Grundy is clearly the ruck, so that's not changing. Grundy doesn't miss games. In the last 3 years, he's missed 3 games. 2 of them were due to a sling tackle against Ben Brown that everyone said was a good tackle, but just knocked him in the head.
That's right.
There's a lot of debate on that one.
That was like a week or two after Dangerfields, wasn't it? I feel like it was really close afterwards.
And the only other game he's missed in the last 3 years was round 1, 2016, when Bucks decided to drop Grundy and play Witts as the number 1 ruck. That was Dane Swan. That was Dane Swan's last game, and Grundy's been the man since. So he hasn't been injured in 3 years. Played every other game.
Oh, wow.
So he's safe as houses in that respect.
Well, you're right. He's got the durability, absolutely. His fantasy scoring basement is absolutely insane. Like his 3 lowest scores last year in Supercoach, the ones where he didn't turn up, 99, 98, 95. They're his 3 lowest scores last year in Supercoach. Then from a dream team and fantasy perspective, 84. That was in that round 1 game against the Hawks, where it was more defined ruck sharing. 89 against Brisbane. That was kind of probably ruck sharing too. McInerney and Stephen Martin. Probably the only game that would give some cause for concern was against West Coast in round 17. But you see then back in the grand final, he goes and gets a 99 in the grand final. He goes and gets a 110 in Dream Team and Fantasy. So there's really no game over the past 30-odd games that you go, gee whiz, that burned me having Brodie Grundy.
No, and the follow on from that, so you're basically saying his absolute floor in fantasy is about 80. Yeah. His absolute floor in Supercoach is 90. Like, that's his worst game. So the reason why that should excite you, especially with Tom Mitchell down, you're talking about captains, Collingwood plays either the first or second game of the round in 10 of the first 11 rounds.
Oh!
So Dream Team has a rolling lockout. Yes! Supercoach always has the rolling lockout.
There's a couple of Thursday night games early on for AFL fantasy coaches as well.
Yep. And there's an Anzac Day game in there too in about round 5. So if you need a vice-captain option, I mean, Collingwood is the team to get one from, and Grundy is as good a choice as any.
Certainly, and as we talk about the Collingwood midfield, and we've highlighted a number of Collingwood players across the 50 most relevant, there is still some question marks about how does the Beams inclusion impact some of their fantasy scoring, but you're right. Mason Cox's role is not going to change so substantially that it's going to dint on what happens to Brodie Grundy. So he is from a Collingwood perspective, the clear number one vice-captaincy option for your rolling lockout formats and for your Wednesday, Thursday night games for AFL fantasy. I also think, and I'm curious to get your take on it, do these new ruck rules help or hurt some of our ruckmen? The ability now from stoppages around the ground and throw-ins where they can just juke the ball straight out. We may see a decrease potentially in some hit-outs. We may. It's a little bit unknown how some of these rule changes will or won't impact fantasy. But I also think someone like Brodie, who's always around the contest, plenty of tackles, loves to, dish it off to that phenomenal midfield around him. I'm not too sure that those... I know some have suggested it, but I'm certainly not sold on the fact that these new ruck rules will make a substantial dent on his fantasy output.
Well, in fact, the ruck rule that you can take it straight out of the ruck now, he's one of the main guys doing that anyway.
Yeah.
He just gets the body. You can see he's made it a focus. He just nudges the guy out of the way, grabs it, kicks it 30, 40 metres, He's already done it anyway, so I don't know that's going to change all that much. If anything, you'll just get a couple more kicks rather than hit-outs from it because it's not a free kick against you now.
Well, that's right. He's the one that's going to get less frees against. He had 36 free kicks against him last year if you include finals right throughout the process of that. So there's always multiple reasons why a ruckman gives away a free against them. But you're right. I'm not too big on the fact that that's going to really dent him. You've mentioned a couple of times on the podcast, ever since we started, that no two ruckman the same two has gone on from 1 year following through to be the same two top scoring rucks the new season in. There are still some question marks about Max Gawn and what may or may not happen with Braden Bruce. Can you see any reason outside of injury that we don't have Brodie Grundy as one of our top two scoring rucks this year?
Yeah, well, it seems unlikely at this time of year, but I'm sure if we sat here and did at the start of the year podcast on rucks every year for 20 years, we would have said the same about a lot of other guys.
That's true.
So if you assume no injury, well, first thing you're going to need a couple of other ruckmen to step up. So you'd assume if you sat here and said Grundy didn't get injured and it wasn't one of the top two rucks, how would it happen? Well, probably Gawn would be one of the guys to beat him, logically, because he's close. And then someone else is just going to step up, like whoever it is. Maybe Goldstein, maybe Steph Martin. Steph Martin's had the scoring punch. Brisbane's a team on the rise.
Yeah.
And maybe Grundy just dips sort of 10, 15 points. Maybe teams just really target him. Maybe, something like that. You wouldn't think he's going to miss it by a huge amount, though.
No, you would. And that's probably what makes coaches a little bit nervous. We talked about this with Jimmy just yesterday on the Jackson McRae podcast. He was number 4 in the 50 most relevant, how he's had such a phenomenal year, and yet there feels like there's these doubts and concerns about whether he can do it again. Yet you look at Brodie Grundy, who had an even more substantially increased and more dominant year. There doesn't seem to be the kind of doubts and question marks that he can go there again. Does that concern you a little bit, that it seems to be this lay-down misère? Grundy's going to be a top 2 or 3 player across the formats. He'll average 120, 130. No problems. He'll kill it. Go, go, go. Is there any concerns for you that so much of the fantasy community is like, it's a safer houses pick? Or is it just he literally is that safe of a selection?
Well, I think the slight difference with him and McRae is that McRae shot up very early in his career and then just kind of hovered.
Kind of held.
I mean, part of that is because of the forward role, because he got forward status a year, and it's just, coaching roles move around.
Sure.
And there's a bit of less of that with Grundy in that he's unlikely to get a role change. The second thing is, it's a big average. However good you are and however much of an upward trajectory you are, how many players have backed up 130 average in Supercoach?
Not many.
Or 120 average in fantasy? Like, I would guess
Gary.
Swan has
Gary.
in fantasy and Ablett in Supercoach.
Yeah.
Has anyone else backed up those
without
kind of
numbers? It's rarefied air, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
And to do it 22 games. Some may do it for 5, 6, 7, 8 games. And that's the thing, when you go and spend this big outlay of cash on these big guys, yes, you're probably actually going to be able to get them, cheaper at round 5 or 6 due to the way the magic number works. Unless they score well over their current price average, you will pick them up marginally cheaper. The thing is, what's the points they get in that period of time? Absolutely. And can you afford to get them at their cheapest price in round 4, 5, and 6 to make missing them, quote unquote, worth it? And then if you're missing guys like Laird, Lloyd, Gawn, McRae, there's only so many of these big boys that you can miss early on. I know there's plenty of value, but there's only so many of these big boys that you can miss on before it starts to hurt.
Yeah, that's right. And if you don't start with him and you want to trade him in, his buy round may cause you to really have a problem there because he shares his buy round with Steph Martin, Max Gawn, and Geelong. So if you have Darcy Fort, if
Sure.
Darcy Fort happens to play round one, if a lot of people have him as their R3, if you've got Gawn and Darcy Fort, can you really trade in Grundy? All of your three rucks then have the same buy round.
Well, that's it. It just means that your best 18 on field are going to have to come from the other three scoring lines, and that does put a concern potentially for you there. I think it's manageable and workable through there, but it's one of those interesting ones, isn't it? We rarely get that from a fantasy perspective. Sometimes we're a little bit lucky with our top two rucks that they're on different lines, but it looks very much like Gawn and Grundy, who are both in the top 10 of the 50 most relevant. Both look like they're fit and firing, ready to roll. I know he's been on some light duties just over the past week, but everything coming out of Collingwood suggests he'll be fine for the JLT. He got through all of the kind of pre-season fitness and endurance sort of work that they got into the tank sort of pre-Christmas and early through January, so I wouldn't be too concerned about that. If he starts to miss some JLT matches, then maybe concern can certainly rise. But right now for me, in all formats, I'm starting with Brodie Grundy. What about for you?
Yeah, I've got him in all three for sure. And, we're talking about the same two rucks have never been the same. So if you go back and work out the top two averaging rucks, this is just fantasy. Supercoach should be slightly different.
Sure.
But in fantasy, even though the top two have never been identical 2 years in a row, there was a streak of about 10 years where Dean Cox was in like 8 or 9 of those years.
Insane.
So it was Cox and someone. So if you think that Grundy is a bit like Cox, that'd be the sort of thing you'd be hoping for.
Yeah, I certainly think if there's ever a player that's likely to do it, given the there are some parallels between the two in the type of player they are. Not heaps, but there's enough of them in terms of their ability to get around the ground. I definitely think he's the one. Let's talk drafts, because this is a real interesting one for me. Safe to say, if you don't have a top 2 selection, you don't have a chance at picking Brodie Grundy. I think no matter the format, he's gone inside the top 2 selections. Here's the thing. If you pick him at number 1, regardless of the format, you go lock in Grundy at number 1. Everyone's going to get, assuming it's a 10-team league, a bunch of selections, 19-odd selections before it gets back to you. Chances are most of the top 8 to 10 midfielders, probably off the board, most of them. The top 2 or 3 forwards and backs, probably off the board at this point in time. Are you worried as a drafter that now all of a sudden your likely M1 is probably in that second bunch back, likely to be a sort of a 10 to 15 average kind of guy? Are you worried about that damaging your structure too much? Or are you just, as a drafter, going, well, I'm getting a guy that's 10, 15, 20, 30 points better than what anyone else could ever get in this line, and I'm going to make the points up here in somewhere else? What's your thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a maths exercise, isn't it? You're thinking this is the difference between this ruck and the next ruck if I get them later, and how many points do I lose on the midfielder or the defender or whatever. So there's probably less of a drop from the number 1 mid down to the number 10 mid than there is for the number 1 ruck down to even the number 3 or 4 ruck.
Yeah.
Based on last year.
Yeah.
Depends what you think everyone's going at this year. So I don't think it's too much of a concern, but you'd want to pick up at least one mid in your back-to-backs on the way back.
Yeah, you absolutely would. Look, I think Brodie Grundy, there's plenty of value late in the forward lines and late in the back lines every single year in drafts. And yes, you can get some value selections in your rucks late in the drafts. I definitely don't disagree with that statement. I just think if Brodie Grundy's there at pick 1 or 2, I wouldn't let somebody else get the quote-unquote bargain in the round 1 selection who's got a pick in round 3, at 3, 4 or 5, going to get a guy that's going 120 in the ruck or potentially, 130 in Supercoach ruck. So, yeah, I probably wouldn't let him slide past the second selection in a first round, that's for sure. Keeper leagues, you're just not selling him. You're just not. He's going in the same place in a brand new keeper league. He's going in those top couple of selections no matter what. And if you own him in a keeper league, it does not matter what anybody offers you. You just politely say, what, Tim?
No.
Get stuffed, as I may have had several times from you in a keeper league. Hey, man, appreciate your thoughts today as we talked about Brodie Grundy.
Yep, cheers.
If you want to check out the article on Brodie, it is online now for you at coachespanel.tv, as well as all of the other players we have revealed so far in the 50 most relevant. If you're enjoying these daily podcasts thus far, I'd encourage you, leave a 5-star rating and review. It really helps us out here at the Coaches Panel. And if you do want some exclusive content landing for our Patreons, you can go and get all the links and details for signing up for that at coachespanel.tv. Our top 2 of the 50 most relevant are about to land. And who do you think is going to be in the top 2?